Got it. I'm being recorded. Okay, is that okay for everybody? Okay. Thank you, JP, for the introduction. Again, I'm Satoko Kakihara. My presentation today is titled Immortal History, Golden Kamui, Race, and Affecting Contemporary Social Change. So before I begin, my actual paper is not as lofty as its title suggests. And I will be reading this presentation so that I can stay on time today. So I want to start by introducing Japanese manga. Japanese comic books called manga offer works dealing with a wide variety of themes, from love and romance, which are the same thing, to politics and dystopia. Some manga works involve heavy research and serve as great teaching tools on topics like sports, food culture, and historical figures. Golden Kamui is one such example. Written and illustrated by Noda Satoru, it represents, through action and humor, the history of the Japanese occupation and settlement of the northern islands of Hokkaido since the late 1800s, along with the colonization of its indigenous Ainu people. The series has been serialized since 2014 in the weekly Young Jump Comics magazine, which is directed toward a young male adult readership, in case you could not tell from the cover. In the Japanese comic book industry, publishing companies have different comics magazine titles, some weekly and some monthly. They're divided according to market segmentation, from young girls and young boys to older men and older women. The industry operates on an ageist and binary heteronormative approach to its readers. These magazines collect and publish titles from various writers and artists. So for example, you can pick up 1 week's copy of Weekly Young Jump and read the latest issues of Golden Kamui, Jupiteria, and Kingdom all in one. Although Golden Kamui is geared toward young adult men, it has found both popular and critical acclaim from a much wider audience. And that there is the photo, that in the photo is the series editor Okuma Hako of Golden Kamui, not the actual author or creator of Golden Kamui. This paper examines Golden Kamui and how it has made issues of race and Japanese colonial history more accessible within the popular media landscape. The positive reception of the series has opened up sites for recognition of and discussions about both Ainu history and the community currently remaining in Japan's Hokkaido region. The creator Noda, who is from Hokkaido, though he is not of Ainu descent, is known for spending a lot of effort accurately depicting geographies, languages, and customs of the Ainu. This presentation argues that while the comic book medium is a powerful tool for increasing interest in and accessibility of complex topics, such as the occupation of Ainu land, efforts must still be made to effect change in contemporary Japan in relation to the nation state's historical past. Again, it's not as grand, this actual presentation. So the Golden Kamui manga, I want to talk a little bit about. Golden Kamui is written and drawn by Noda Satoru. His last name is Noda. This is his second major comic book series. His first work was titled Spina Marada. Spina Marada, sorry, I don't know how I would say that in English. And Spina Marada is about a main character who used to do figure skating, but then switches to ice hockey, also set in Hokkaido. Noda is from Hokkaido, which you can think of as the Alaska of Japan. It is far, it is big, and it is very, very cold. The manga was adapted into an animated TV series starting in 2018, which often is an indication of the popularity of the manga work. So there's been a lot of critical acclaim and support from the Ainu community for the manga. The manga has received several awards, including the Cartoon Grand Prize in 2016 and the Tezuka Osamu Cultural Prize in 2018, named after the respected manga artist and anime director who created works like Mighty Atom and Kimba the White Lion. So the image there is a parody version of Noda looking like Tezuka Osamu, and I think many people know Mighty Atom from outside of Japan as well. Most recently in 2021, it received the Social Impact Award at the Japan Media Arts Festival, where artists serve as judges to choose works by other artists that are worthy of recognition. The manga has also received support and approval from various Ainu associations, such as the Nibutani Ainu Cultural Museum, the Foundation for Ainu Culture and National Ainu Museum, and the Ainu Association of Hokkaido. These organizations have remarked on the level of research that is done for the writing of the manga, as well as for the ways in which the manga makes information about the Ainu available to a new generation of readers in and outside of Japan. So the story of Golden Kamui itself, the episode 1 of Golden Kamui manga begins in 1904, where we meet our protagonist, Sugimoto Saichi, in battle against a Russian troop during the Russo-Japanese War. No matter what Sugimoto goes through, though, he can't seem to die, which is how he gets the nickname Immortal Sugimoto, which is then where the title of my presentation comes from today. So unfortunately for Immortal Sugimoto, he survives the war, but his best friend does not. And you can see sort of in the image, his friend disintegrating into pieces. Sugimoto needs money to take care of his best friend's widow after the war. And Sugimoto learns about the Ainu's gold that can only be found if he collects the map leading to it in the form of tattoos on prisoners' bodies. So here's an example of what the tattoo map looks like. That's been tattooed onto various individual prisoners. As Sugimoto is trying to decide what to do about this discovery, he's attacked by a hungry bear. And this is where we meet our other protagonist, Ashirpa, who is Ainu. They start traveling through the mountain together to figure out this Ainu gold mystery and to find the tattoo map. And that's how the story of the manga begins. And in terms of the manga's treatment of ideas about race, culture, and history, the Ainu are just one example of people who were colonized and oppressed by the Japanese government starting in the late 1800s, including through forced assimilation. This map, which, sorry, it's from Wikipedia, is from Indonesia from the 1940s, which is another such place, along with places like Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria in Northeast China. We learn a lot about Ainu culture through this manga, as Noda inserts detailed explanations throughout his work, like here. So if you can see sort of in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, there's a square text box that has explicit sort of narrator explanations of Ainu hunting practices. And then Ashirpa as a character also, her speech bubbles are also explaining what the poison arrow is doing to the bear that she just shot. And these lessons don't come in a weird and fetishized way about Ainu culture, which is significant, especially for Japanese popular culture, for which fetishization tends to be a tendency both within and from outside of Japan. But I think one of the things that we can think about is how different kinds of collaborations with the manga happen and how we might interpret them. So first example of collaboration is what's called a stamp rally in Japan. As part of Golden Kamui's ability to influence spheres beyond popular culture, there has been increased contents tourism to Hokkaido because of it. One example of this is a stamp rally, which is a popular activity done with various themes in Japan. The idea is that you have a passport, and every time you visit a place, you get a stamp in your passport. You fill all the spots on the passport and you get a prize. Don't know what the prize is. There have been 2 Hokkaido Supports Golden Kamui stamp rallies to date, where participants visit and learn about various historical sites in Hokkaido related to Ainu culture. So you can see in the map across Hokkaido, the various places people can go. And organized by the Good Day Hokkaido Travel Bureau, the rallies are meant to encourage Golden Kamui fans to visit the Northern Island. And during the coronavirus pandemic, AR or augmented reality tourism also has been going on when people couldn't really travel easily. These promotional events attract visitors to Hokkaido who otherwise may not have chosen to go, and it helps those visitors to learn more about various historical sites in Hokkaido. Yet there also has been literature to discuss the problematics of contents tourism, such as the commodification of often minoritized cultures. How then do we reconcile the increased interest in Ainu regions with this market-based treatment of their culture? A second collab that I want to talk about is with Sapporo Beer. Another promotional collaboration is between Sapporo Beer Company and Golden Kamui. So Sapporo Beer was established in 1876 as a brewery by government officials in the city of Sapporo to help develop Hokkaido when they were settling and colonizing Hokkaido. Sapporo Beer released limited edition cans of their Sapporo Classic product with Golden Kamui anime characters on them, available to purchase only in Hokkaido. So these became sort of rare items that you could pick up. And in fact, episode 261 of the manga features the first advertising card that Sapporo Beer used starting back in 1907. So you can see that image of the beer bottle shaped car that the characters are driving. These elements are historically accurate, of course, and the Hokkaido connection with a popular intellectual property like Golden Kamui is one that Sapporo Beer wouldn't miss as a promotional campaign. But the question remains of how the popularity of a manga like Golden Kamui simply turns into the capitalist exploitation of that popularity and the people that it is about. So what does this all mean? These are just two examples of commercial collaborations with Golden Kamui that have made Ainu history more accessible and brought into the popular media the relationship between Japanese and Ainu communities. And there are other collaborations as well, such as with hot springs facilities, which is big in Japan and very popular. With big chains like Don Quixote, it's kind of like a big box store with acrylic stands of characters dressed in sort of modern kinds of, not modern, but non-typical character dress. And also with cafes with themed menus throughout Japan, so you can eat character-related curries and hot pots and toast and things like that. I personally love Golden Kamui because it has great characters and story, and because it teaches us how Japan-Ainu relations established in the early 1900s still function today through the idea of difference. Doesn't the exotic food the characters eat sound like fun? And isn't it totally different from what you know and eat? Doesn't it make you want to visit Hokkaido so that you can learn more about Ainu food and culture? And don't you want to buy Ainu souvenirs so that you can own a part of it, including their land and gold? Just kidding. Though historically different, these phenomena are two sides of the same racial difference coin. One, you're different from us, so we want to travel to your village to take pictures and buy souvenirs. And two, you're different from us, so we want to colonize and control you. Golden Kamui is a manga series that has the potential to help affect contemporary social change by teaching audiences about these issues related to racial difference in Japan. An award such as the Social Impact Award at the Japan Media Arts Festival seem to suggest that people acknowledge its social significance, or at least what the manga and anime perhaps is capable of doing. Yet there's always a sense of, is this still okay? Is this too commercial? Is this going a little too far? And that may be the whole point of the manga, that we as readers and viewers never feel too uncomfortable that we cannot ask these questions about, the collaborations that happen, and that we also never feel too complacent that we accept anything that the media throw at us. So that's sort of the end point of my current presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you all being here, and I look forward to any conversations that we might have.
Sorry, that was great. I was applauding with my mute on. Wonderful. Thank you, Sadako. That was wonderful. So without further ado, let me introduce, our next presenter. Here we go. So we have Leanne. Leanne is a white, deaf lesbian currently earning a second MA in Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University. Her academic focus is on accurate and respectful representations of marginalized persons, communities in literature, specifically Marvel's representations of deafness in comics. She hopes to eventually establish her own publishing company to amplify those stories by #OwnVoicesWriters. Leanne also holds 2 degrees in English Literature and Language, BA Henderson State University 2018, MA St. Mary's University 2020, a certificate from the Denver Publishing Institute 2019, and is a founding member of the Modcast in the US, an accessible literary podcast and blog. So without further ado, let me remove Spotlight and give Leanne spotlight.
Let me go ahead and share my screen really quick. Okay, I think that's working. All right, then. Let me see if I can move this around really quick. Okay. Hello, I'm Leanne. So today I'm going to be discussing different views on the evolution of Hawkeye in the comic, specifically in the comics, not in the MCU. And we want to examine a couple different perspectives of various Hawkeye characters and the different characters that have shown up in the comic books, specifically female representation and equality within the comic books. We know that there's women there, but how are they represented? Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, all right. So who are we going to be discussing? I'm going to be focusing on 3 characters. They're all technically Hawkeyes, so to speak. First, you have Clint Barton. And he's the first Hawkeye that we are introduced to. And then we also have, oh, excuse me. So his parents died and he decided to join a circus where he learned archery. And after being there for a little while, he decided to set off on his own and assumed the name of Hawkeye. Next, we have Barbara Bobby Morse, otherwise known as Mockingbird. She trained with a private organization and was hired under this organization to specifically look for corruption within their organization, the CTE organization. And so she was hired to find evidence to address that corruption and ends up running into Clint Barton, who is also working as security for CTE. And next we have Kate Bishop. So she also assumes the name of Hawkeye. Understand Clint and Kate kind of simultaneously hold this name. And Kate was really admired Clint's Hawkeye representation, and what she wanted to do was mentor under him. And eventually she was able to convince Clint to take her up and train her. And they eventually ended up sharing the name as they both operated under the same mantle. Now, this is going to be a little confusing talking about 2 Hawkeyes, but they're different people. So I'm going to refer to Clint as Clint Eye, and then I'm going to refer to Kate as Kate Eye. But understand they are both Hawkeye. So Clint is seen as one of the more important characters because, of course, he has that male representation and he's accredited a lot more of the work that was seen and done over the course of many of the comics. For example, in the case of CTE, the corporation where Mockingbird was hired to find corruption, Clint was actually working in security at the same time. So when Mockingbird found the corruption within the CTE, the cross technology enterprise that is, she informed Clint of the corruption and he initially dismissed her. He was not very receptive of the evidence that she found. But backing up just a little bit, in the comic books in general, we do tend to see that most of our comic books are written from kind of a white cishet normative perspective until we get to WW2. You had a lot of influences from that era where, you know, the men were sent to war and women kind of had to take up the mantle of going and bringing home the bread and collecting the income, bringing home the bacon. And so that influenced our what we saw in comic books. We saw a lot more heroines beginning to show up. And it was a lot more female empowerment in terms of our heroines. We have examples like Wonder Woman was very popular, who came out of that. But really, that was kind of it. And so you have a lot of comic books that are coming out now with more female representation. Thanks to Gail Simone in 1999, who really kind of took this up on herself. So Gail Simone writes to dozens of comic books at that time. She's realizing that there's a pattern here, that a lot of the female characters are unnecessarily being tortured and being used as punishment against male protagonists, as opposed to just representing female heroism themselves. And this was a serious turning point for the comic book industry. Due to her efforts, we really did start to see a shift in the way that female protagonists were represented within the comic book section. Hawkeye specifically, we start to notice that the artwork, the style that our heroines are being drawn in are much different. Right? We kind of see an evolution of their costuming, but there's still a lot of objectification that's happening, right? You have this kind of back-breaking pose where our female protagonists are standing in unconventionally impossible poses to sort of highlight the goods, so to speak. But we don't really see that happening to our male protagonists, right? We want them standing in powerful, strong poses. And of course, we want to see that for our female protagonists as well. So typically, when you are reading about female protagonists, you might see a feminizing of their names, especially if they're affiliated with an already male protagonist. So you have examples like She-Hulk, She-Thing, Miss Thing, Spider-Woman, so on and so forth. Now, Hawkeye is kind of a bit of an exception here, at least with Kate-Eye. So down at the left, you can see that you have Kate here, and who's having a conversation with Deadpool. And he's kind of teasing her. He's trying to come up with some feminized version of her name, like She-Hulk or Hawk-S, what have you. But Kate Hawk is really not having it. She kind of shuts that conversation down with Deadpool and says, no, I'm just Hawkeye. And then you see at the top right, you see another snippet of a comic. Kate Hawk is having a conversation with another teammate, and she realized there's a little bit of messiness, there's some time travel involved, and she has to kind of give a different name so it doesn't mess up the timeline. She ends up self-feminizing. She calls herself Hawk-S, and she really regretted doing that. So in terms of characters, what's the whole point of like the superhero persona, right? Like, what's the point of saying, oh, I'm Iron Man, or oh, I'm Spider-Man? There's a couple of reasons why these superhero personas are important. The costume, the name, all of it. It's really important to kind of keep your secret identity separate. You don't want to be sharing private information with those that could potentially harm you. And another good example is to kind of signal to the audience what types of powers you're going to have, right? So on Spider-Man, for example, you see webbing on his costume. And so you wouldn't expect Spider-Man to fight with fire. That would be kind of weird. But with women, there's kind of an additional perk to the costume. It's to tantalize the audience, to really give them something to look at, if you will. And so we see a very interesting evolution of the Hawkeye outfit, both for Clint Eye and Kate Eye. And very early in the series, you can see that he's got a full mask on, and then we get to the sort of 90s era where he's kind of got his He-Man era style outfit, and eventually it de-evolves into just a shirt and pants, very utilitarian. It doesn't even really represent what we would traditionally call a superhero outfit. However, when you look at Mockingbird's costume, understand there is a little bit of confusion because she did go by a different name at one point, and then there was some copyright thing. A movie company went and copyrighted the Huntress, which is what she was previously called as. So Marvel kind of had to change her name to Mockingbird. But, you know, her outfit is very clearly a superhero outfit. Her colors have been relatively consistent throughout various evolutions, but you can see that the costumes have, they're very revealing and they're very shape-esque. Now, as for Kate Eye, I want to say it was about 2008. We start to see you see on the bottom right, she's kind of departing from what we've historically seen Hawkeye look like, right? She's got a really unique mask. She has this kind of slender dress of very form-fitting and this belt that's not really purposeful at all. And then she slowly evolves into this very famous outfit, this one piece with like the cutout hip holes, which is a little bit more utilitarian, but still very revealing in a way. And that design, of course, was made by men. And, you know, she's got this belt on her still with these hip huggers. It doesn't even hoop onto anything. I mean, I can't even see a utilitarian purpose for this belt, right? It still has a lot of non-functionality to it. Overall, the development of Hawkeye has been relatively progressive. There's still been a lot of challenges, and even in general with our representation of female protagonists, we're seeing better representation, but we're not really seeing full equality. There's still quite a bit of sexism that appears in different comic books. And that's certainly something we're hoping will change as the comic book industry progresses. And I think that's it for my presentation. I'm going to wrap that up. Thank you. Oh, I'm going to breathe now.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Leanne. Cool. Awesome. I'm just checking a couple things. Yeah. So let me just go. So our next presentation, just to stay out, we're making great time. Just want to make sure everyone's okay. We have J. Muriel Moore, who has a PhD in English language and literature from Queen's University, Canada, granted in 2016, and specializes in narrative theory, reader response theory, genre fiction, and popular culture. She currently teaches courses on disability representation, culture, and justice at Ryerson University, Canada. Her most recent research projects include an investigation of the dead body as an object that both prompts and frustrates narrative compulsions in the genre of American hard-boiled detective fiction. and an exploration of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper through the lenses of maternal feminism, Darwinism, mental illness, and the trope of the natural mother in the later Victorian and modern periods. So let me just make sure, cool. Let me make sure you're highlighted, Jessica. Okay, go for it, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you for that really great introduction. It was a bit of a mouthful, I think. And I should add, I'm actually also teaching a gender studies course at Queen's on feminist science fiction and fantasy. So Leanne, your talk is actually really fascinating, especially because a lot of my students are talking about female superheroes and how they're being represented in comics. So thank you for that. All right, so my slides are mostly images from Kill 6 Billion Demons, so mostly just let yourself soak in the imagery that's coming through in this particular work. The slides don't really do it justice, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that that's mostly what the slides are. All right. Once the center of heaven, throne, the Red City, is now a purgatory, abandoned by its gods, whose corpses are the literal foundations upon which humanity and demons build their own little hells. Once fought over by 777,777 kings from just as many worlds, the city has grown stagnant under the decaying rule of the last remaining 7. A tenuous pact of mutually assured destruction keeps the peace between these kings, and order is loosely upheld by angels who are unable to keep up with the immorality and corruption that overflows the city's walls. There is no God, the kings are corrupt and useless, and as a city, Throne resonates with Augustine's words, "The punishment of every disordered mind is its own disorder." It is a world where everyone is only looking out for their own self-serving passions and avarices, where there is a culture of every creature for itself, and when Alison Ruth is flung into Throne, she is forced to confront the unruled boundaries of this multidimensional hellscape as well as her own. Tom Parkinson Morgan's Kill 6 Billion Demons has been running as a webcomic since 2013, but was published in hard copy by Image Comics in 2016. IO9 noted that its art is stuffed with sumptuous insanity, and a review in Publishers Weekly highlighted Parkinson Morgan's impressive world-building abilities through an enticingly baffling blend of world religions and sketchy but nuanced coloring. The graphic novel's varied multidimensionality and blurred boundaries is its underlying strength, as it explores questions of destruction and salvation through ontological perspectives on the coherent or whole self as a fallacy in need of redefinition. Traditionally, the fragmented, divided self has been viewed as a destruction of or weakness in the individual. Kill 6 Billion Demons, however, questions the boundaries of division within the self and the city, proposing that the coherent whole self is equally doomed to failure, being an illusion in itself, and that division can also be a metaphor for identity construction, formulating a bond between diverse individuals and between the manifold but equally necessary facets of our own complex identity. Jack Crittenden, in Beyond Individualism, provides a compelling way of thinking about the multidimensionality of the self. Developmental structuralism. He writes, quote, "The term was first used in biology to indicate that an organism undergoes a process of growth through increasingly complex forms of differentiation from and reintegration of earlier forms," end quote. This process suggests a protean evolution of the individual rather than a crystallization or solidification of a fixed identity. Kill 6 Billion Demons title plays on the idiom to kill or to face your demons, meaning to psychologically confront aspects of yourself that terrify, confuse, frighten, or shame you. The pieces of yourself you think of as ugly, horrific, or disdainful. In the process, we are given the choice: kill your demons and overcome them, or, as Kill 6 Billion Demons actually suggests, acknowledge and accept them as part of who you are. If our demons are part of us, it seems the latter is a much more beneficial outcome. Why destroy yourself when you can better know thyself? Selfhood could then be seen as a process of making and unmaking, and killing 6 billion demons is perhaps more akin to coming to terms with our own fractal self-construction, creating a new, much more hybrid identity that accepts and even lays claim to a protean adaptability of the self, capable of transformation without sacrificing any integral piece of the multidimensional self. The deep metaphorical relationship between cities and journeys of self-discovery is commonly explored in literature. Antony Balasopoulos assesses the views of the Greek philosophers on the ideal city, the polis, and writes, quote, "Polis is a name for the indeterminate ensemble of relationships between territory, its conversion into built environment, a population that is mutable and mobile in both a physical and a constitutional sense, and the religious, mythological, political, and juridical forms that bind this population into a threatened and precarious unity," end quote. In short, quote, "The city is not one thing or another because it is no one thing," end quote. And as Aristotle notes, the city is by nature the multitude. Even if it were possible to unify the city, it should not be done, for that would instead undo the city. In turn, Balasopoulos points out that the various social groups of a city function as modalities of the soul, and that they are functional capacities of a single entity, even as they are discrete elements of it. He also draws on Greek philosophy's attention to the process of, sorry, I got a sudden pop up on the screen I'm reading from. There we go. I think we're good now. Okay. Balasopoulos also draws on Greek philosophy's attention to the process of being and becoming, with becoming as the ideal force of the human body and soul. And this becoming for both the city and the individual is quote, "something that can mediate between oneness and multiplicity," end quote, being one and many. Demons then reflects Donna Haraway's use of the Cthulhu scene as a way of exploring complex interdependencies. In Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene, Haraway expands her original cyborg manifesto to include a more primordial, tentacular thinking that defies conventions of bounded individualism, creating instead unbounded individualism. We might call this self-interdependence, a recognition of the self's need to rely on a multitude of parts and facets to survive, grow, and come into being on its own terms, not contained, but as Haraway would put it, chthonic. Just as a social community may only thrive by recognizing the interdependency of its collective parts and its potential for change. And I think Parkinson Morgan cleverly, if unknowingly, illustrates Haraway's Staying with the Trouble as a way of navigating and experiencing ourselves and our world. Haraway writes, quote, "Staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings," end quote. And for Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, quote, requires making oddkin. That is, we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations, in hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all, end quote. In this way, the tentacular unbounded self is also the empowered self, capable of adapting and making use of inherent abilities and complexities and mediating oneness and multiplicity to more reflexively engage with the world. Parkinson Morgan's Demons illustrates on an epic allegorical scale this unbounded individualism. I suggest this chthonic Staying with the Trouble is enacted at 3 levels of demons: in its mythology, in the social structures of Throne as a City, and in Allison's own journey of self-discovery. In Throne's mythology, the first command of the god Yisun is, "Let there be no Genesis." Within this mythology is the belief that God has always existed and has never existed. Yisun, all-powerful, yet living without meaning or perception, rejected singularity and circularity and made the first and greatest division of self. This division gave birth to White Un, master of all that was not, and Black Yis, master of all that is. These dual natures waged war against one another and then made love. But this intimacy bears not a union, but rather further blissful division. And from Yis and Un were birthed the multiplicity, 777 gods who raised the city of throne. Throughout the story, psalms are also scattered between chapter sections, and one of the very first is titled The Grand Enemy Called I. A god called Hansa, in asking whether he should be an ant or a giant in relation to the world around him, is given by Yisun the answer, quote, both, or either, when it suits you. Destroy the grand enemy called I. This early psalm sets the tone for the graphic novel, presenting an overarching imperative to destroy and recreate the individual self as singular and instead embrace a protean nature. Parkinson Morgan's mythos thus functions to highlight the multidimensional self, as it is in itself, built on the power of division, as well as the fallacy of singularity, and so values division as an essential part of how the self and social interactions thrive and evolve. Throne as a City explores a unique multidimensionality as well by illustrating a social polis deeply corrupted by a rampant hedonistic individualism encapsulated within a chaotic free-for-all. Throne is described as the center of the wheel and the center of all universes. When the gods died, the gates of heaven were cracked open by King Zos. Others followed, converging the multiple dimensions of the universe into one kingdom. Thus began the rule of the demiurges, who created the keys of kings and linked all worlds to Throne. But with this conquering came an unstable unification, drawing up a singular hunger for dominion, which consumed the kings. This singularity made them go mad and set upon one another until only 7 demiurges remained. Their lust for singularity, a singular, all-powerful rule over the universe, brings only corruption, chaos, and destruction. The center cannot hold. And this is enacted at every tier of the city, as creatures from every world survive only by a rule of feast or famine. Throne's overruling and rampant individualism, every I for their self, only brings destruction and degradation. By contrast, Allison's close-knit but socially diverse group, growing loyal to one another every minute while maintaining their own individuality, in turn represent a different kind of fragmentation, an interdependency of what makes these individuals, human, demon, angel, and more, powerful not in their complete unification, but in their very diversity that serves to support and empower one another to better see their own selves. Where individualism, as traditionally viewed, places all power on a destructive, self-serving singular I, ruled by boundaries, what Haraway calls unbounded individualism offers opportunities to create power from respected divisions and strength from the chthonic self, capable of change and transformation precisely by staying with the trouble. Allison Ruth is a very human girl from a very human Earth that has until now stayed separate from Throne, its gate remaining closed. She likes Korean dramas and anime. She wanted to be Sailor Moon when she was young. She struggles with body and self-esteem issues and works hard to make herself into something others want her to be, going to the gym, dyeing her hair, posting media life. Volume 1, her engaging with sex with her boyfriend, not because she is ready to be intimate or because she desires him, but because she scheduled the loss of her virginity. Her roommates, as does the reader, notice that she is an indecisive basket weave of anxiety and stress, with no notion of what she wants to do with her life or what she wants from it. She merely projects a whole self to others that, as we see, immediately comes apart at the seams when she is thrust into Throne with a key of kings in her head, an artifact that opens gates and rips creation. Allison's first adventure in Throne displaces all sense of who she is and how she perceives herself, leaving her to ask, "Who the hell am I staring at?" when contemplating her own reflection. Her friends remind her that she has to stop trying to be what other people want her to be, and her return to Throne is brought about by her own deliberate choice to find out precisely who she is by facing her own demons. During her journey through Throne, one of the 7 demiurges, Incubus, provides Allison with an opportunity, full unfettered access to the power of her key to unlock her potential, hiding away her self-loathing and making her all-powerful. While this empowerment is thrilling and confidence-inducing at first, it results in a dangerous power trip that nearly costs Allison her friends and allies, as well as a sense of who she is. In this form, she uses and abuses others, acts recklessly and arrogantly, and very nearly kills her friend Chio in her one-minded ambition to achieve her goal. This unified power within herself puts Allison out of control rather than in control, and Chio recognizes that Allison is not herself. We then become privy to the interiority of Allison, where hundreds of Allisons manifesting different emotions and elements of her identity converse and bicker while one overly powerful fragment of self controls all of Allison's real actions and body. This encounter with multiple pieces of who she is reveals to Allison that this multidimensionality is who she is. She states, "It's me, even though I hate it. It's still part of who I am. I've grown. I've learned from those Allisons, and I guess I'm still struggling with some of them." This self gains strength through the recognition of her own interdependent multidimensionality and realizes that the terrible part of her who is in control, the capable one, is also a part of her, stating she needs me and I need her because she is me. She also acknowledges that she is both a mess and strong and does not have to defeat this dimension of herself. She needs to accept her. Accepting that no part of her should be cut off or sacrificed is part of her journey toward becoming an empowered and complex I, capable of not only coming to terms with her own inner demons, but utilizing them as an essential collective identity that creates opportunities for growth and transformation, as well as realizing the full dimensionality of the self. Augustine may have said that the punishment of every disordered mind is its own disorder, but Kill 6 Billion Demons suggests that disorder may be a form of empowerment and a source of transformation, change, and self-realization that can only be discovered through our own inherent multidimensionality as individuals and as communities. The graphic novel suggests that our destruction may be our salvation, insofar as it results in a creation of a new world order and a new sense of self, and so offers a look at the importance of intersectionality and interdependency, not just in communities, but in our own individual identities, with a recognition that while fragmentation can be destructive, it can also be a strength that may help us redefine and reimagine our own boundaries. Thank you.
Nice, very nice. Cool. So thank you very much. That was wonderful. We just have our final presenter, who is Madeline Hennessy. Please allow me to make sure first that she has. Yes, cool. Thank you for pinning her. And let me go introduce. So Madeline Hennessy is an MA in Literature candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. She holds an MFA in Poetry from the Bennington Writing Seminars and a BA in English from Skidmore College. Her primary research interests lie in narratives of collective trauma, displacement, and dispossession that seek to reconstruct lost or mythologized homelands. She approaches questions of archive, documentation, and representation through lenses of memory and trauma studies, material theory, and post-colonial theory.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm super happy to be here among these other fabulous presenters. My presentation today is called The Border and the Grid, the comics grid as a model for reconstruction in Joe Sacco's comics journalism. From the inception of the form, comics have been defined by the grid. Today, I'd like to consider the comics grid as a means for representing and grappling with historical and contemporary borders, the legacies of lines drawn during a colonial past and subsequent conflicts in the work of comics journalist Joe Sacco. Comic scholars teach us how the grammar of comics, the tension between the visual profusion of panels and the silence of gutters, uniquely expresses the experience of violence and trauma, but they often overlook the more fundamental political economy of the comics grid, which remains crucial even, or perhaps most, when it seems to disappear. In comparing manifestations of the comics grid in Joe Sacco's now canonical Palestine with those in his more recent Paying to Land, I will argue both for the persistent influence of the grid structure and for its capacity to model imaginative reconstruction. In Palestine, Sacco manipulates the grid to convey claustrophobic confinement and overwhelming expansion for a people and a region whose borders are both disputed sites of violence and physical scars of traumatic loss. While the grid feels less overt in paying the land, it is no less influential, just as the varying imprints of colonialism shape the lives depicted in both texts. And just as the comic's grid underlies even the most free-form page, the borderline, be it physical or theoretical, underpins the modern world, reflecting a history of colonial divisions, even those that have been erased or redrawn. When we recognize the rigidity of the grid undergirds the form's very fluidity, the grid emerges as a model for reimagining destructive borders as the very scaffolding for creativity and repair in even the most restricted spaces. Hilary Shute, Jean-Marie Villejoen, and Dominic Davies each point out the unique capacity of comics form to document, transmit, and even resist the ineffable experience of violence and trauma. In particular, Shute identifies a form of counter-inscription in which graphic narratives materially retrace inscriptional effacement. They repeat and reconstruct in order to counteract. Davies sees a formal affiliation between bordered spaces of incarceration and the bordered sequential components of graphic narrative, pointing out the recent concern of comics and graphic narrative with making these spaces of exception, such as border zones and refugee camps, visible, while also documenting the histories of their contestation. For all three, the gutter is the central mechanism in a grammar of comics that enables it to engage with traumatic experience by involving the reader, viewer in the text, both physically and cognitively, as they imaginatively fill in the gaps between each panel. What is missing here is a critical attention to the structure of the grid. In my view, what Shute refers to as the imaginary regularity of the grid is essential to the push and pull of the regular and irregular that engenders experimentation and innovation in comics. Thus, the grid itself can be understood as the most basic means of comics' counter-inscription, transfer, and contestation. Within comics' long tradition of engagement with war, violence, and trauma, it is this resistance, this contestation or counter-inscription that I aim to highlight in Sacco's work. I propose that the economy of the grid, with and against which graphic narrative constructs and reconstructs itself and its stories, not only enables the form to involve readers in bordered experience, but also offers a model for how borders themselves can engender reimagining, reconstruction, and repair by returning our attention to the grid. Even in the absence of paneling, we not only demystify Sacco's representational forms, but also open up the ways comics can afford a material and political restructuring. The grid is most dramatically apparent in Palestine in the chapter entitled Moderate Pressure, which depicts the imprisonment and interrogation of a Palestinian man, quote, suspected of belonging to an illegal organization. In preparing us for this account, Sacco meaningfully references Marvel Comics, not only invoking its imaginative parallel universes, but also calling to mind its standardized visual format, which he will emulate in the ensuing pages. On page 103, Israeli soldiers enter Ghassan's home. The page is divided into three large panels, one of which comprises the entire top half of the page. While the gutter in earlier chapters has been white or merely a thin borderline, the gutters in this chapter are black. Its panels are set at regimented right angles, contrasting with the frequently tilted and irregular paneling in preceding pages. As Ghassan is taken from his home to a police station and eventually to a cell, the grid progressively constricts, from 6 panels on page 104 to 9 panels on 105, 12 on 106, 16 on 107 and 108, and 20 on 109 through 112. The grid expands dramatically on page 113, which depicts Ghassan's release, with 6 panels comprising the top half of the page and a single large panel comprising the bottom half. The constricting panels correspond to the increasing tightness of his bonds and decreasing size of his confinement space, but they serve most dramatically to illustrate the protraction of time, the seemingly interminable repetitions of physical suffering and brief respites. During the 19 days depicted in these 11 pages, Ghassan is tied to chairs, deprived of sleep by loud music, fed irregularly, and moved from place to place, usually with a filthy sack over his head. All the while, he is periodically interrogated by police officers demanding a confession, and brought to court, where again and again the judge grants the police more time to, quote, find additional evidence. Through the growing profusion of panels, the reader is led painstakingly through Ghassan's experience, and the relief on the final page is both palpable and jarring. Like Ghassan, we have grown accustomed to the pattern of the judge granting the police's requests for more time. After the solitude and claustrophobia of the preceding pages, the expansive, crowded street scene is startling. Thus, in this chapter, the grid is overtly visible, especially rigid, and directly communicative of the experience depicted, from the arbitrary and seemingly indefinite confinement to the sudden and equally inexplicable release. On the splash pages that open refugee land, however, the grid seems to disappear entirely. On these 2 borderless pages, motor vehicles and donkey carts ford flooded, unpaved roads, and sheep graze in overflowing dumpsters. In the foreground, small groups of women and children struggle to navigate the sodden landscape, as squat cement buildings, their tin roofs patched with tarps and held down by sandbags and tires, packed tightly together, comprise an expansive background that exceeds the page's edges. On these pages, Davies observes a lack of conventional comics infrastructure, grids, gutters, and other architectural materials. That parallel the deprivation of Palestinians of their basic human rights, signified by the camp's material lack of infrastructure, and his impression that Sacco's portrait of the camp is cut away from the comic's organizing infrastructural system of grids and panels. While the link Davies draws between the instability of refugee life and the visual disarray of these pages is compelling, his analysis conveys the sense that the grid is exclusively signaled through paneling, and that the absence of paneling and gutters turns the comics page into unstructured representation. While Sacco has abandoned panels and gutters to depict Nusrat refugee camp, the shadow of the grid informs the layout of the scene. Not only do the rectangular shapes of the van and the strip of windows, cars, dumpsters, and buildings break up the pages, but the figures themselves are also arranged between the lines created by the flooding waters, roads, and telephone poles, just as the structure of government and military forces, despite their neglect of infrastructure, underlie the conditions and the very existence of this place. The structure of the grid scaffolds the way Sacco has drawn it. This gives new meaning to Davies' insistence that there is reparative work also contained in Sacco's exceptional image. He points to Palestinians' cautious construction of their own informal infrastructure infrastructure registers, in turn, their enduring economic activity and social resilience. In my reading, this literal reparative work, as well as the formal experimentation Sacco uses to reflect the refugees' experience, take place at the behest of the grid, not in its absence. Overt paneling is frequently absent in Paying the Land, but even on its most wide open pages, the grid's influence can be observed, frequently dividing its pages into 3 or 4 page width strips delineated by subtle scenic or natural boundaries. Overt grid structures become more visible in the text when non-Dene government or commercial forces enter the scene, such as on page 78, where an iconic image of Dene bush life, a team of dogs pulling a sled along a snowy path through the forest, is abruptly cut off by a straight line demarcating a group of white men wielding geometric implements, literally measuring and dividing the swirled map spread before them. On the facing page, square panels frame a section of map at the top left, further dividing into territories, creating a grid within grid effect, and a black square at the top right, in which the waving rectangles of the Canadian and Northwest Territories flags overlap, their 3 stripes layering division upon division. Most gridded of all are the pages that depict the residential schools notorious for abuse that re-educated Canada's Indigenous children until 1996. As Valerie Conrad and Paul Andrew, survivors of these institutions, relate their memories, Sacco illustrates the uniformity enforced by the residential school system. In this spread, a young Valerie confronts an overwhelming rows of identical haircuts and uniforms in the cafeteria, and in the bottom panel on page 132, sits at a desk, one square indistinguishable among those of the other girls in the classroom. This panel is mirrored by the bottom panel of page 133, in which 6 boys stand perfectly straight in a row, their clothing and haircuts identical, the straight lines of their bodies and trousers dividing the panel, and the plaid pattern of their shirts comprising still more sets of grids. The visual markers of rigid uniform structure reflects the restrictive and de-individualizing conditions Paul describes. But as in Palestine, pages that convey hope and resilience are ordered by the grid as well. The young leaders and activists we meet in the final section of the book are introduced on page 233 in a gridded formation, the 4 young people standing in a row in a horizontal strip of page above the paneled portraits of their parents, 5 of Sacco's most prominent interviewees. On page 235, each youth dominates their own page width panel, which makes space not only for their voices, but also for their memories and aspirations. Across these pages, Sacco's treatment of the organizing infrastructural system of comics is fluid, with only some panels fully bordered, the rest bleeding into a full page background on which the panels are superimposed. His formal experimentation plays directly off of the history of the grid, just as these young leaders' imagined futures respond directly to the traumas suffered by their community. Even on this boundless spread, in which another young activist kneels over a caribou he has just shot, the grid is ever present, enacting the tension between stillness and movement, the spatialization of time. I looked at the big rocks that I was standing on, Eugene Boulanger recalls, and realized how many countless thousands of moccasins have touched these rocks over the years. Here, the recursive, repeated pattern of seasonal movement is not a source of restriction, but instead a grounding anchor for positive growth. On the facing page, the lines of the landscape, mountain peaks, tree lines, and riverbanks reveal an organizing structure that fosters connection rather than division and reaches simultaneously back into the past and forward into a possible future.
Throughout the long history of comics form, the grid hasn't gone anywhere. Its foundational structure runs deeper than the formal manifestations of panels and gutters. If these comprise the unique grammar of comics, the grid is its alphabet, so essential that it fades into the background and yet is the very stuff that builds the world. Like the geopolitical borders that divide our world, the grid represents restriction, but with restriction comes the possibility of resistance, of escape. The representational experimentation of creators like Joe Sacco, that which makes it possible for their work to document and perhaps even transmit some of the experience of communities decimated, dispossessed, and confined by colonial forces, is in constant conversation and negotiation with the shadow of the grid, its very rigidity, scaffolding ever newer iterations. Thus, the comics grid, seeming mark of regimentation and confinement, in fact presents a model for resistance, self-determination, and repair, even when it seems least possible. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. So now, everyone, thank you. Awesome, awesome papers. I'm sorry I'm so dark in my room. Not on purpose. So I'm going to hand it over to everyone. This is a discussion session. So what we can do is you can just unmute yourself and ask someone a question. We have Satoko. We just had Madeline. Before Madeline, we had Jessica. Leanne before Jessica, and Satoko was our first. Was our first presenter. So if you have questions or if you'd like to raise your hand, I'll be watching. I'll keep myself muted. I'm gonna take off my video so I can turn on a light. So go ahead if you'd like to ask a question.
I'm just gonna say, JP, you should have just left it. It looked like you were coming up from the depths of hell, which I found very appropriate and relevant. So
Thank you, Jessica. Cool. So I'm just going to throw out a question. So for everyone, we'll work backwards. The question is, how did you come to this project and how did you initiate it? Like inspiration, impetus. Can we start with Madeline, please? Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. Jody, raise your hand. Jody, please go ahead. And your question is probably better than mine. Jody, please ask.
No, it's probably not better than yours because it's only a half-formed thought. But I was trying to think a little bit about what bound together so many of these wonderful talks today. And especially during a time of COVID-19, something that I was thinking about was the power of fandom to enter back into the world that was originally conceived as a comic book universe. In many ways, I'm thinking about the fact that so many more comics have their start now in an online world. They're not necessarily going through a conventional publishing process anymore. And even Satoko, in thinking a little bit about Golden Kamui, how much of a phenomenon it has become. It really transcends now at this point the world of simply the manga. It's now become an entire enterprise in its own right. So again, this is a very half-formed question, but I'm curious if any of you would like to speak to that sort of cyclical power of fandom, especially perhaps in online communities who are responding. In some cases, some of your papers touched on communities that are often perhaps unheard or invisible, thinking again about Joe Sacco. And then Leanne, you noted perhaps, or at least alluded to the fact that there may still be some very crucial problems with representation in the comic book industry and the part of writers and artists. So it seems like, again, stakeholder involvement is also very much a theme that binds all of your talks together. So putting that out there, but issues of fandom, stakeholder involvement, where do we see that going in the future, especially now that many things have moved to online forums? Thank you again for the wonderful talks.
I can take a brief stab.
I thank you so much for your question. I'm thinking in particular about really the power of social media for refugee and migrant self-representation. And so things like, sort of one-off, simple cartoons are becoming a means really to demonstrate, especially through the pandemic, the individual experience of refugees and sort of how they see themselves in their communities. And I agree that the online format is a powerful place where the mediation of sort of others' views, others' lenses are really not applied. And I think that the practice of following social media accounts with sort of incredible creators creates some of that social feedback and that solidarity that potentially is most powerful when it comes from the ground up.
I just to add on to that, because that was very wonderfully said, but I look a lot at popular culture and how stories are often used to create the way we think about important social issues or important identities that might be marginalized. And I think it's almost impossible to avoid exploitation of stories, especially in popular culture when they become popular. It's always going to be a problem. But there is always going to be the benefit of, especially with our social media being what it is now, there is more and manifold ways to share stories that were otherwise never going to be told, never going to reach any sort of mainstream platform. And I think as far as I approach popular culture, even when it's problematically represented, it's less about the journey of how it was produced and perhaps more about how it impacts its audience. So I also think it's important perhaps for producers and creators and writers to create platforms to allow people to talk about the subject matters in their work. So whether it's Golden Kamuy and, maybe it's, the characters are on beer cans, but it's still like a point where people can talk about what the story represents. And whether they do that superficially or like very much in depth, I think is always a step forward. So I look at it in a very positive way, even if there's always going to be problematic aspects of the sort of commercially driven popular culture. It can't always be bad, but it can't always be exactly the way we want it to be. But it's nice to think that more people have more access to more stories.
I want to make sure that I'm not, if other people have questions, of course, please let me know. But I think those are really wonderful points that you raised, Jody, especially when you think about fandom. So one thing that's interesting, at least for Japanese manga and Japanese animes, you have a lot of what we got from the United States, the practice of cosplay. So there are a lot of people who are learning a lot about traditional Ainu dress so that they can make accurate kinds of cosplay, which I think is really interesting. And I know not every kind of graphic novel or comics lends itself to cosplay, but I wonder, I mean, for cosplay culture, we also have ideas about safety and what, right, cosplay as not consent, kind of an idea. So I wonder when you can use cosplay as a way to sort of address representation. There's a way to be authentic and accurate when you're portraying a character, but you can also sort of improve upon a character's costume when you're cosplaying. So I wonder when things like that can happen for people who are trying to participate in popular culture. So yeah, but thank you for those thoughts and all the wonderful presentations as well.
Cool. Leanne, would you like to contribute to the question?
Let me see here. One thing that comes up is the importance of the impact of the story. But I think more important than that is who's telling the story. The approaches that we take to impacting other people with our narratives, right? There's so many different approaches for trying to get your message across. And of course, privilege holds a huge point of contingency with that. And, you know, if you're a member of a specific culture, you want that culture to be positively represented. So who's telling the story of that culture? Are they a member of that culture? Right? So, for example, are hearing people writing deaf characters? Do they really understand the deaf experience? It can be tough. It can be very tough. We want that representation, but then not everybody who wants to be represented is getting the same opportunities to have that representation. And that definitely impacts the way we tell stories. And I definitely understand, you know, I want, as a deaf writer myself, I want to make sure that I am representing a myriad of different narratives when I'm doing my storytelling process.
Nice. Thank you, Leanne. That's awesome. I would like to say more and respond, but I'm going to withhold and say, folks, other questions that you'd like to ask, or maybe you would like to direct a response to a colleague's presentation.
So I have questions for all of these, all of the presentations, especially because I'm not familiar with any of the texts. So I apologize that my questions are kind of basic. But maybe I'll start with a question about the kill 6 billion demons. So I do not know this text. I do not know this story. I don't know anything about the creator. Can you give us like a 1 minute description of what the story is?
It's a good question. And the basic story is Alison Ruth is either purposefully or accidentally selected to be the proxy of a dead king of Throne. He shoves his key into her head, which allows her to essentially control creation. And then she is flown into Throne, where she encounters many different worlds and has to try and figure out whether she actually wants to be part of the story or if she just wants to go home. Or she has to decide, is she going to save her boyfriend, who everyone thinks was supposed to be the proxy of the god, but was carried away by the demiurges? Is she supposed to rescue him, or should she just leave him be? So a lot of the story just feels a lot more like Alison just figuring out what she wants to do as part of this whole different world. And the plot is more secondary to the actual experience of the graphic novel. So yeah, the basic is it's a journey of self-discovery. It's a journey where Alison tries to decide whether she wants to be a hero or just a bystander in this story. And as it goes on, you begin to see her get stronger and more comfortable with the idea that she can make her own decisions and she can be a king and she can be a hero if she wants to be. Or she can choose to walk away if she wants to, but she feels empowered in more ways than she ever did before.
Thank you. That's really interesting, actually.
Please allow me to jump in. Craig Svanken was here a moment ago. He's wanted to say we have, the forum on Sunday. So we're tomorrow. It's about space and storytelling. If you're interested, it is under agenda schedule on Whova. And you can enter the PAMLA forum on Sunday at 12:20 p.m. or a bit before that. It says the general membership meeting starts at 11:50 in the same room. So he wanted me to share because stories, narratives, and space. Very much a nice theme for our panel. Oh, more than nice, it's a very wonderful theme. So he just wanted me to share that with you. With that said, other questions? I'm watching the time. Other questions that you would like to share, or maybe like make a comment to someone's presentation? I'm going to mute myself.
Sorry, just in the chat, Jody asked Leanne that she had they had a podcast. So now we have, thank you.
I just dropped it in the chat. I just saw the comment, and so I just dropped the link in the chat.
So Sadako, with your Golden Kamuy looks really cool. I've seen the anime on Crunchyroll, and I'm like, I gotta watch it. Do you think with basically creating the products and the publication of the series through other outside means, do you think that's a positive thing for Hokkaido, or do you think that might, like you mentioned, fetishize Hokkaido or the Ainu people? Or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think it is complicated, but I agree that not everything has to be negatively interpreted. So I think it's great that there are beer cans with the characters, because I too want these beer cans. And I too want to go to Hokkaido and play the stamp rally. So one of the things that's well known about the creation of the story is that when Noda was working, of course, because he is not Ainu, from the initial stages, he consulted with members of the Ainu community and representatives of sort of the organizations on how these characters should be depicted. And there was, from the very beginning, the discussion that the community did not want a representation of the sad, tragic Ainu, which had been very common until that point, repeating this theme of people who have been marginalized, and a community that is growing smaller and smaller. So I think it's always been complex, that it's not like having Golden Kamuy become very popular is going to bring this community back. But it has made people be interested in the language, so more people are learning the language, a language that was close to being extinct, and no one was being a live speaker of the language. So will these people become fluent speakers of the Ainu language? No, but is it at least bringing attention to the fact that there are Ainu language and other languages that are close to extinction? Yes, and I think in a lot of ways we can think about what's productive. Will people always criticize that Noda is not Ainu? Yeah, and is he gonna make mistakes in the representations of these characters? Yes, but is it positive that he's writing them? Yes. So I don't know. I guess it's a cautious excitement. So I don't know if that helps.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you. Just in time, because we have 4 minutes till 5. I would like to just ask, so PAMLA next year, 2022, is going to be at UCLA in Los Angeles, California. It's at the Conference Convention Hotel on UCLA property in Westwood. So it's very nice. We're going to host it there late October, early November. It'll be a weekend usually. Is anyone interested in being the presiding officer for comics and graphic narratives? That entails you have to be there for all 3 days. It's usually, Thursday, 3-4 days. You have to be there. You will basically receive the proposals, read them, and basically decide who you would like to present. If you receive a bunch of great proposals, you can have more than one panel. So you can nominate yourself or nominate some. Yeah, we'll just go with that. If you're not interested, that's totally cool. We'll find we'll find someone. Is anyone interested in nominating themselves for presiding officer for comics and graphic narratives next year? Oh, okay, sorry. Well, if you are, let me know. If you're not, that's fine. But Pamela is very fun. Even if you just can go, if you can meet us in Los Angeles, it's in Westwood, which I think is pretty close to LAX. So if you can fly to LAX, you can get to Westwood with ease. So I live in Southern California, so I hope to see you there. With that said, we have 2 minutes. Let me mute again and say I have plenty of questions for everybody, but other thoughts, please.
I don't have any particular thoughts, but I was actually very curious about the question you initially asked, JP, about how people came to their talks, because I can't say mine is especially interesting. I saw the panel. I said, "Oh, I would like to participate. I love Kill 6 Billion Demons," so I came up with something. So it's not very academic, but I am curious about how all three of you came to your particular presentation topics. If we can do sort of like a 1-minute bite for each person.
I'll yield my time to others if Madeline and Leanne want to speak.
I can go if nobody else wants to. So when I was, I'm a big fan of Hawkeye, obviously. Traditionally, Hawkeye was a deaf character, so obviously I am obsessed with him. And I just really think, he's a cool character, you know, that's mainly it.
Madeline?
Oh, sure, I can go super quick. So I am really, as of like the last year, very new to comics, and sort of I have an interest in trauma studies and got the Sacco recommendation, and I have been startled in like, I ended up teaching like as a TA. I ended up TAing a comics class, and I thought, oh no, I don't know anything. And now I really feel like it's fed my intellectual work in an enormous way. The pedagogy has been like, it's the coolest way ever to teach close reading. So yeah, I just kind of fell into it, and Sacco has been a particularly important author in my research. But it's been really fun to be here, and these were really some really stimulating conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Real quick, so PAMLA is a regional MLA conference. We have the MLA conferences across the country. We have wonderful folks from Washington, Colorado, Canada. So if you can't make it to us in LA, which I understand, please look for your regional conference for MLA, and hopefully you can make it to us in LA, or we'll make it to you wherever you are. Thank you very much for being here, and we only have to stop because, yeah, for many reasons we don't need to. So thanks. I hope you have a great time and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.